Good evening, guys. Welcome to another Bethany Homegroup session. Really glad to have you guys here. Really glad you guys are taking the time to spend with each other, spend in the presence of God, in community with other fellow Christians. And today we're going to jump right back into the next session of chapter 4 of James. And there's a few very interesting topics. So first of all, I'd like for you guys to spend a minute and read chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. So those are some interesting verses in that part of the chapter. Seems a bit harsh, right? He writes that you desire and you do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you quarrel. And these are just like some very harsh, it seems like, accusations that James is throwing around. And why do you think James is trying to say with these verses, and why is he attacking fellow Christians with such things? Go ahead and take a moment to discuss that with the group. So coming back to these verses, right? James, he kind of throws around some very critical words at fellow Christians, and at the time he was addressing the Christians of that time, but these are just as easily applicable into our lives. And one of the main sins that he approaches and points out is actually the sin of pride. And the thing about pride is nobody wants to admit that they're proud, right? It's often one of the most painful things to admit is that you're proud, because that would be trampling on your own pride, right? It takes humility to admit that you're proud. And we often just get used to calling ourselves Christians and tend to rely on ourselves and forget that God is the center of it all, and that in itself is pride. So when James brings it up, he mentions that the things we do ask for and that God does give us, we tend to use that for our own gains because we don't have God in our center. And that's one of the main things to strive for. In other verses of the Bible, God talks about how God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. And pride generally promotes strife, and that's why God is mostly against it, right? And in these verses, you could see that you quarrel with each other, you commit murder, and these are all things that are born from pride. And C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, has a very powerful quote, and he says that for pride is a spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love, contentment, or even common sense. And it's very hard to love, it's very hard to be happy and be content when pride is in the way. But further in the Bible, verse 7 and 8, it talks about what cures pride. And the answer to that, my friends, is humility. And verse 7 says, "Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." So the number one thing is draw near to God and submit to God. And those are all, counterparts of pride. They can't coexist. Submission and pride are just naturally cannot coexist. You have to abandon pride to be able to submit to someone or to something. And the Bible calls us, or James calls us, to submit to God. So for the next part of the passage, verses 11 and 12, James kind of switches gears from the topic of pride and humility and goes into judging a brother, or not judging a brother per se. And a point I wanted to bring up is maybe a situation that you guys, or I'm sure at least some of us have seen in our own lives from personal experience, that where you're in a situation when someone is judging or criticizing another person, a fellow Christian, and in return that person quotes the Bible. It's like, well, it says thou shalt not judge, right? And verses 11 and 12 kind of reinforce that statement. And James states that he who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. So here James reinforces the importance of not judging one another, but is all judging a sin? And what do you think? Is it okay to judge? Take a moment and discuss that with the group. It is important to find the correct distinction between judgment, right? James in chapter 4, verse 11 says, "Do not speak against one another." In some versions of the Bible, it translates as "do not slander one another." And slander is a very old word, but it's still used today, right? And it just means not smearing each other with negativity or putting each other down or misleading, perhaps deliberately misleading information about each other. And the difference is the motives, right? What are the motives for correcting someone or judging someone? And a lot of the bad ones, right, are, for selfish gain, to make yourself look good in front of others, right? That person's bad, but look at me. Or any kind of really just selfish ambition, pride, rivalry, or hatred. Maybe you hate that person and you want to put them down in front of others. And the Bible does not condone that. It condemns it, right? And the other part of the judgment side is when it's a fellow Christian and you see that they're in the wrong and you want to correct them, not for your selfish gain, but to help them. Because we as Christians are called to encourage one another and help build each other up rather than tear each other down for the kingdom, right? We're trying to reach the end game, the end goal, heaven together. So it's very important, and we have to do this with love. And we also have to be open to criticism, right? It's not easy to receive criticism. I speak from my personal experience, Sometimes it's the hardest thing. And it's very important to be able to make that distinction. So in this next part, in verses 13 through 17 of the same chapter, James kind of jumps into a new topic again. And this time it's about boasting about tomorrow. And James rebukes the person that makes future plans without any regard for God's providence. And the question is, how confident are we that we're going to be alive tomorrow, right? Nobody knows how many days we have left, and all of our future events are conditional, right? We don't know what tomorrow will bring, the Bible says. And only God knows how many days we have in our life, and it's important to consider in being diligent to serve Him today and in what He has planned for us. So the question I want to ask you guys for you to discuss is, how much do I focus on the future versus the present? You guys find yourself just looking way far in advance and not really considering where you're at now and how you should be serving God right now? Take a moment to discuss and just share your thoughts on that. So James mentions how boasting about one's own power and one's accomplishment is actually evil. And the Christian, you and I, brothers and sisters, the main thing that we should be boasting about in our lives is God's grace and God's mercy and everything that He's done for us. And 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 30 kind of highlights that. And another honorable mention is Acts chapter 17, verse 28. And it says that it is arrogance not to live our lives in awareness that in God we live and move and have our own being. So everything we do should be for God, through God, and by His plan, right? So we have to consistently search for what He wants us to do in our lives. And one question I'd like to ask, kind of as just a personal, to take with you home, is just examine yourselves tonight, and look into what we boast about in our lives. Maybe it's our cars, maybe it's our grades or whatever, our friends, our clothes, and just try to remember that God is the center of it all, and we want to fulfill His destiny for us in our life, His calling for us in our lives, and serve Him and be boastful only about Him, because He deserves all the glory and praise. Be blessed tonight. Have an amazing week.